Catie Fenn, welcome to the Human to Human podcast. So grateful to have you today.
I'm so happy to be here today.
How is life across the border right now?
Life across the border is actually great. The only thing that's not great is that I'm sure there are many people that are in the same boat, whether it's the US, Canada one or other ones, but it's a pretty crazy thing with all the border restrictions, restricting family, restricting couples. So that's the only thing that's crazy about being here.
But I trust all is well, all is safe.
All is well, all is safe. I'm definitely exactly where I'm supposed to be right now for this.
I feel like that's your answer to a lot of things in life. And I'm so excited to dive into where you are today. But how would Catie define who Catie is today?
I would define who I am today as a beacon of inspiration and love, and an example of what's possible when you stop trying to figure everything out and you allow yourself to surrender more fully to life.
Stop trying to figure everything out. I feel like a lot of people are going to be able to relate to that. You're the second former lawyer turned entrepreneur onto this podcast. And I've been getting questions saying, Karan, everyone on your podcast is a former lawyer. What's going on? What is it about that?
I think that, honestly, I think that what happens, why a lot of lawyers leave law, are for two reasons. The first is that it's incredibly demanding and you have to love it so much. I actually loved the demands of it and I loved law. So that wasn't mine, but that's why a lot of lawyers leave. And the other reason that I think that so many people get funneled into law, just if you have sort of, if you're sort of, into school and maybe you study politics, and then many people get funneled into law, I think at a time when we're really young and we haven't fully figured out what it is that we want to do. And then you end up several years later in this job. And then all of a sudden you're having an awakening of finally knowing what you want to do. And then people leave at that point. It's not really anything about law. I think it's just a lot of people when they're young get funneled into that career path without having actually contemplated what it is that they want to do. So that is my 2 cents on why so many lawyers leave law. It's because we're too young when we're going to school. We don't know what we want.
Is that how you fell into it?
No, I actually just loved Judge Judy and Legally Blonde growing up. That was the thing. No one in my family is a lawyer. There was no pressure. Nothing was going into me going into law. But the first was I had this crazy obsession with Judge Judy when I was a child, and then it was actually just through school. I took a law class in high school. I took law classes when I was in university, and then when I was in university, I met with a career counselor, and I was overthinking everything of what I should do. And she said, "Well, what do you like to study?" And I was like, I love studying law. I find it so fascinating. She was like, well, then why don't you just go to law school? And it never really that never sank into me. You should just go do and study the things that you actually enjoy studying. So that's actually how I got into it. I'm like, okay, I have no idea what being a lawyer entails, but I really love studying the law. So that's how I got into it.
So once you got your feet wet, you got immersed into that legal lawyer world. What was it that didn't really land well with you?
Actually, in full transparency, I truly loved law. Like I actually would say that there's not really one. I had the best law experience. Like I really love law. And part of my story is just you can love something and then something that you love more comes along. I once had someone describe a similar situation where he said, my career, he was in real estate at the time. And he said, I loved real estate, but it's like you're in this safe, comfortable relationship. And then all of a sudden your soulmate walks up. And for me, that was really my experience in law. Like I loved the challenge of it. I had an incredible mentor. I had an amazing firm. I loved it. But it was just, I started to love my passion projects more, which then eventually became my business and the work that I do now. I'll also just say, like, I was a lawyer for 7 years. I really lived that experience fully. And so it wasn't for me either, like I got into it and right away ducked dead. I really had that full experience. And by the time that I left, I just kind of felt like, after your first 7 years in law, you really, the law, you know how to move your cases along. And so I was just ready for a new experience too.
That's so interesting because we met, I don't know, maybe over a year ago.
Yeah.
Actually, definitely over a year ago. We met like 2 years ago when I first came here. And I knew Catie as not a lawyer. I knew Catie as, more of a spiritual being, somebody to facilitate intimate conversations, somebody to challenge you to think outside of what's traditional. That's how I view Catie, just from an outsider's standpoint. And I guess, former lawyer turned soul guide. Tell me more about that.
So I think that from my path from being a lawyer has helped me so much in the work that I do now, in that law is very strategic. Being a lawyer is a lot about, okay, these are the laws, and then you're just applying facts to a framework. And basically what's happened in becoming a soul guide for people is, and ultimately what I'm doing is just helping people stop being who they've conditioned to be, who everyone expects them to be, and really align with the truth of who they actually are and who they are now. Maybe they're, holding on to a past version of who they are, and helping them build out a life that is a reflection of that. But it's still framework based too, because I've just worked with so many people now that I kind of know the steps that people go through, and how you have to kind of work your way through a transformation process. And then I just apply it, but from this sort of spiritual or soul lens. So that's that they've married the two, but I actually never intended to be a soul guide. I really started to come into it in a way that where I was just surrendering. Basically, I started to talk a lot about the things that I was into. I started to share, spaces and conversations and bring people together. And what naturally came as a result of that were people saying, okay, well, you've expanded in this way. How can I? And then that's really how it started naturally to be a case of me starting to guide others. Was I would talk so much about what I was passionate about in my own experience. And then other people said, okay, well, wait a second, how can I find that sense of center, or that sense of connection to myself, or to reflect or make a change in that way?
That's so fascinating, because you hear of the term lawyer and then you hear the term soul guide. They don't even belong in the same industry. They don't even belong in the same, not even in the same stadium.
No.
And where my head goes is that we fear change. We fear anything that's different. And if you ask my parents, they're like, grow up, be a lawyer. It's stable. You got your job for the next 40 years. And that's what people would look at as a very stable career choice. And some would consider, oh my God, you're a lawyer. Like you have it all. So what was it about? Like, there must've been some calling, some sort of intuition, feeling inside of you that said, I think my passions are elsewhere. What was that?
So it started when I first started practicing law. I was super stressed out. I went into law. I went into law straight out of school, and before that, I'd only worked in bars. So all of a sudden, I find myself in a firm, and I'm so stressed out because I've not only never worked as a lawyer before, but I've also never worked in an office situation before. So I'm up to my eyeballs in just figuring out everything. And to deal with this stress, I used to do a lot of yoga when I was in university and law school, and I just had this intuition. I really need to get back to the mat, and I think I need to start meditating. So I started meditating just to help me deal with the stresses of being a young lawyer, having no young lawyer knows what they're doing. So not knowing what I'm doing, I started to meditate. In that space of me meditating, the first thing that actually happened was I started to get an intuition, actually not related to my career at all. It was actually related to my relationship at the time. And I was in a relationship that was very, like, had we both stayed on a very traditional path in that sense, it would have been perfect. But I just started to get this sense that the life that he and I are building is not actually the life that I want. It would have been quite traditional, basically, to say the least. And what actually happened is my intuition first started to say, it's not actually my career, it's this relationship and this future that I have with this partner that doesn't sit well for me. And it's not what I want. I want more adventure. I want more passion. I want more freedom. And so the first path is that inner voice started to come through just around my relationship, saying, even though this is perfect on paper, even though you're, going to get engaged to this person this year, you need to walk away from this relationship. So that was the first thing. I had to learn to trust the inner voice first in that relationship, to let it go, which at the time also made no sense, because, we were a great couple. And so that was my first experience of breaking the mold of expectation, because everyone expected we were going to get married. Everyone thought our relationship was, perfect. And so that was my first experience with it. Soon after I set myself free from that, it allowed me to let that future that he and I had been dreaming of dissolve, which then allowed me to really create this space where I started to think, well, wait a second, what do I want? If it's not that future that he and I were building, what is it? And in meditation, I would contemplate and sit with these questions. And then about 6 months after that breakup happened, I started to just feel deep down like I was supposed to do something else. And what happened is I started to get visions of myself speaking, of leading retreats, of talking about all these things that over the 6 months and prior had really helped me to gain clarity, and to find more connection to myself. Because in that period, I was really reevaluating, well, wait a second, if I'm not the partner of this person, if I'm not this, like, who am I?
Mm.
And so I would see these visions, and then I would sit with it being like, what's that all about? And so then what happened after I would see these visions, not knowing where they were, and I was like, that's interesting that I'm, starting to get these dreams basically come through to me, is that I then started to attract into my life other mentors or people who were doing what I now do. And I didn't know them. I would just see them on YouTube, or I'd see them on Instagram, or whatever else. And it started to validate the dreams that I was having. Here are other people that are living it and doing it. And then the last part of it is I just started to sit with, okay, well, if these people are doing it, how do I get there? Like, I don't know the steps to get there. And so then I just brought it back again to sitting in meditation and starting to ask, okay, well, what's my next step? And I remember really clearly for the first year, the whole thing that we come through every day in meditation was, you need to do the work. In that, in order to teach and speak and lead and facilitate, you need to have done your own personal work. And so for the first year, this was just a little vision in my mind. And I was just really deep into my own work of figuring out, who did I want to be, what parts of my life were built based on like the expectations other people had put, or, okay, you grow up here, you do this thing, and then so I basically just like deconstructed my whole life and then started to reconstruct it based on what actually was authentic to me. And law actually for a long time was part of still that vision. It was just this other, I was like, but there's some piece about me doing this other work, and over the years it shifted and developed. So there's more to that story, but that's kind of that's how it first started.
And I think many people may look at that situation and relate it to their own life, where there is, let's say they're in a similar position, or they're looking at making this change that is different than what's traditional. There's this perceived or inherent risk. I'll call it a perceived risk. There's always this fear. And how are you able to combat some of those fears, or just some of those self-limiting beliefs, saying, hey, like, I'm walking away from something so stable, and this is, my intuition is leaning me in a different direction? Was there any sense of fear?
Of course, but the way that I really combated the fear, and I think where a lot of people run into fear paralysis basically, is that they see the vision. So let's say, like me, you all of a sudden decide, wow, I see that this person is running retreats, or I see this person's, become an amazing speaker, or whatever the thing is, they're in real estate. And you automatically jump to that end vision, and you think of, well, what would, you're like free falling. You don't know all the steps in between it. And I think what helped me a lot to build things out and to not, feel overwhelmed by fear, is that the steps that it took along the way were like different edges of fear that I had to traverse. And the first one, and it was just sort of, I always call them edges, like, just make it to your first edge, and then you'll move through the next piece of the fear. So for me, what happened is that I also was, I'm very pragmatic. Like, at the end of the day, I'm highly spiritual and intuitive, but I just as extremely am logical and pragmatic. And I was a single woman taking care of myself. Like, I was in no rush to let go of my cocoon of my state job that paid me well. And so what I did is very slowly over time really built a solid foundation. But my transition out of law was ultimately 7 years. Like, I spent 5 of those years really deeply building out each facet of the work that I do, such that by the time that it was finally time for me to leave law, which I always trusted would just happen at the time where it felt right on, basically, is when I had built out, I built out a solid business such that there was no risk financially. Like, my business was in a place of support and stability, and I left only at that point. I think a lot of people think that you have the vision and then you have to leave right away. And all the time on my journey, people will say, why are you still practicing law? This is what you want to do. But the whole point, for me at least, was I would rather have that cocoon of safety and support while I'm really building out something solid than just free fall. For me, that I would have been consumed by fear. Like, I wouldn't have done anything, and maybe I would have failed and whatever else. So I think for people, just like start to build it out slowly. I think a lot of people are keen to go all in, and I think that works for some people, but for me, I was like paralyzed by fear. So what felt better and what felt like my edge was like, why don't I just start teaching meditation on the side of my law practice? And then it was, why don't I start coaching too? And then why don't I also add in these women's circles? Then why don't I start to speak? By the end, the thing that was crazy is that I was like, had two full-time jobs. And then at that point I'm like, okay, I should probably leave now. But there was no fear because it was like, it was all built.
I would be so curious to find out how many people don't realize that it was like a 5, 6, 7 year transition, and how many people might just read your bio, let's just say, and think that, hey, Catie just up and left and started her own thing. But there's such a work ethic and such a foundation being built for a number of years before you were ready to jump from that cliff.
Yeah, it was what I also thought was very like, I in retrospect, I now find it interesting is that just what would happen even is I would get an idea. So retreats have become a big part of what I do too. And I had this idea of maybe I'll run a retreat. But what I learned to do was until it felt natural to do it, I just didn't jump. So I kind of had all these puzzle pieces of things I would eventually do. And then each year I would sort of be like, okay, which one do I feel inspired to build out? And what's interesting in retrospect is if there's sort of now like 5 pillars of the work that I do, it's almost as if each year I was guided by my own intuition to really solidly build out just one piece. So one piece was teaching meditation and just teaching movement. The next piece was really deeply coaching. Then it was these gatherings. Then from there, it was retreats. Then from there, it was online programs. And so I think that that allows you the space also to remember that I think that a lot of our work is a creative expression of who we are. And so if you don't give yourself space in that process, like business can, and I think the beauty is that business can be so creative. And I think that giving yourself space and time to build that out is really helpful. But yeah, I think all the time, because I coach a lot of people through too, and they all want to jump. They're like, I'm going to launch my first online program. And then they're expecting people to sign up. But I think that there's so much energetic happening. And if you don't have a solid foundation yourself, this is my spiritual side, like the universe isn't going to bring you your people because you're not ready for that. Like start where you are and have the humbleness to do that. A lot of, people don't like to be humbled, but there's beauty in that.
How do you talk or deal with people that want it now? I mean, we definitely live in this instant gratification. We want this. We've got groceries at our fingertips, movies at our fingertips, water at our fingertips. We don't need to do anything without, we literally have to lift a finger and we have almost everything at our fingertips. But when it comes to success and building your business, again, the part that I'm willing to bet a lot of people didn't see was that 5 years and what was happening in the background. And when you're talking to your clients now and they want something launched in 8 weeks or 12 weeks, because these are magical numbers, how do you deal with some of that, like patience?
I think that part of it is really seeing if something's not developing right away. Or, I'll never say to someone, don't do this, because people got to learn their own lessons. But usually what will happen is someone will put together something because they're like, I'm going to do my online courses are a big thing, right? Everyone wants an online course because they're amazing. You get lots of people into them. Cool. And sometimes they might work the first round for people. I've found that for a lot of times for people, it doesn't. They might get 1 or 2 signups and they were expecting like 40. And what I then say is that, okay, well, there's a reason why. And then there, financial stuff comes in of like, oh my God, how am I going to make money? What's going to happen? Mm-hmm. But the idea then is to focus it back to, well, where are you right now? Like, where are you being guided? Where are you working? What's there for you? There's reasons why you've been guided to the situation that you're currently in, and people are very keen to want to get into the next thing. But instead, I try and bring people back to the present. Like, if you're currently in your job, what skills are you developing there? What relationships are there for you? What challenges are you learning to navigate? What stresses are you learning to deal with? And so I focus on the qualities of whatever their current stuff is that are actually helpful, even if they feel challenging. And the second part of it is, instead of focusing on like the ego prize of, I want this thing, or that would make me the most money, or whatever else, just bringing people back into their heart of thinking, well, what actually feels most natural for you to create right now? What feels exciting for you to do? And in that sense, there, something else might come through of like, oh, it would actually feel really nice to host some online workshops that are just, people could just drop into and I could learn to teach that way. Or, I would love to learn just to coach people. So start there. I think that if you bring it back into your heart of what actually feels most natural to create next or focus in on next, it tends to get people back into alignment versus like, oh, I should do this thing first. But patience is something that's learned over time. And I think my path was especially long. I don't think that a lot of people now, at least, maybe, but I like had an especially long transition out of law. And I think that was partially just because I was so also attached to law and had so much to learn from that experience. But for other people, I think it might not be as long. That's what I also say to people. I'm like, your path probably won't be 7 years like mine, but it's probably not also going to be 3 months like you think it is.
I'm so fascinated by this concept of reconnecting people back to their inner wisdom or reconnecting people back to their why. And I feel like just talking to you, there's this passion, there's this strong sense of why, there's a big reason why you're doing what you're doing. And when people come to you and they have this idea of, hey, like, Catie, can you help me make 10K or 20K or 30K? And they start to lose sight of the why because of the prize at the end of the road. How do you get them back to that connecting with themselves? Because if finances are tight, if it feels like your walls are closing in, if it feels like the world is crumbling around you, nothing is working your way, it's very easy to get in this negative headspace. I see it all the time with entrepreneurs, right? Like one thing goes wrong and 10 amazing things happen. Mm-hmm. All the energy goes on that one thing that went wrong.
Yeah. I think, well, the first thing is when it comes to finances, I always recommend that people have what I call cocoon job. And their cocoon, for me, my cocoon was law. At a certain point, like I knew how to do my practice. Mm-hmm. I was in flow in that. So there wasn't actually a ton of energy that always had to go forward to it. So for all my clients, I'd never want their finances to be the thing that's stressing them out when it comes to their business, because the money will flow. It's just that you have to, it'll flow at the stage and in the manner that you set for yourself too. But sometimes that can take a little while. So that's the first thing, is that I really just really recommend people get cocoon jobs that will basically just cover all their expenses that they need to live. And so for some people that means staying in their job. For some people that means taking a part-time job or doing whatever thing that they need to do that just make sure that all of their basic needs are taken care of. Just from a perspective of our basic needs too, it's just that if our basic needs aren't taken care of, we can't be in the creative space. Like there's a chakra system and the way that energy kind of flows too. And if your basic needs aren't taken care of, the next stage of that creativity, which is what you need for business, it's not going to flow. So the first thing is always have a cocoon job, unless you and maybe your cocoon though is just like a ton of savings that you're okay to dip into, whatever the cocoon is for you. And then the next part of it is just getting people back to the life. Like I always just get people really focused on what's the vision, and for the vision to be really centered around ultimately how do you want to feel? Because if the whole idea comes from I want to make this amount of money, well, it's okay, well, what do you feel is going to be on the other end of that? Is it that you want to feel free, that you can pay for all the things that you want to do or go to the places you want to go? And then from the deeper conversation though is, okay, when you're doing the work that you're doing, what is the impact that you want to make? What skills of yours do you want to be expressed? What talents of yours do you want to be utilized? How do you want to be of service to other people? How do you want to make them feel? And how do you ultimately want to feel? So I find that one of the best ways to get people back into the present is to start focusing on, okay, but enough of this, like the strategy and this, how do you want to feel in 6 months from now? How do you want to feel? That's one of the questions that I'm always focusing on with people. 6 months from now, how do you want to feel? And this month, how can we start to build out ways for you to feel that way? Because that's ultimately what people are after. That feel, even if they're hitting new income goals, it's like, well, I want to feel powerful. I want to, whatever the thing is for them. So if you bring them back to there, it actually helps to stop focus on these other things and starts to think of, okay, well, in this moment, what would feel powerful for you? Maybe it's like they pitch doing a workshop where they're adding a lot of value to a company or whatever else. So that's basically the way that we can shift it.
Can I ask you a personal question?
Yeah.
How do you want to feel 6 months from now?
Okay, so my words right now are organized, because that's a big one for me that I'm not naturally very good at. I'm working really hard this year on getting more organized, feminine, because I really like to feel like I'm in my feminine power. And the last one is empowered, and empowered around everything. I think that there's been a lot this year that's been not feels disempowering because it's been uncertain. And so I feel like, just for me, the word empowerment feels really grounded, really good. There's been a lot of changes that have shifted over the last several months for me, even in terms of my living situation. So just feeling in 6 months from now like I'm really grounded and I'm empowered around that, and I've adjusted to it.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. When people come to you and they say, Catie, I'm at a crossroads. I'm thinking about leaving my job. I'm thinking about leaving the city. I'm thinking about leaving the country. I'm thinking about making a big change. I'm thinking about breaking up in a relationship. The real life changes. I'm sure that conversations with you feel like therapy. I'm sure they do, where you're just there to listen and guide. Do people often come to you in a reactive state? And if so, how do you get them to get out of that fogginess in their mind?
What do you mean by reactive? Like reactive in...
So there's this concept of, dig the well before you're thirsty.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially what I'm saying is, when people are making big life choices, oftentimes they're doing them out of a place of fear, or they're out of a place of reactive to the now. Something unexpected happened, didn't expect it, and now they have to make this big radical change. It's a much smaller percentage of the population make very proactive changes in their life, where they're like, okay, well, 6 months out, this is happening, 12 months out, this is happening, planning for the future, versus getting hit by, let's say, like 2020 rocked everyone, right?
Yeah.
2020 caused a lot of business owners to be reactive. This was something we all unexpected. So and Mike Tyson says everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And I feel like when people get punched in the face, they probably come to you.
Yeah. I call them smackdowns. I'm like, oh, you just got a smackdown.
How do you deal with smackdowns?
Well, the first thing is that I always like to go back to people whenever I call them spiritual smackdowns, and whenever they happen. And I ultimately feel like smackdowns are a kick in the ass to get you to get you in alignment with whatever you're supposed to be doing. The first thing in that conversation becomes, where did you ignore the signs along the way? Because 100% there was some type of internal knowing that this was going to be happening. And so it's whether that you weren't listening to it. I mean, in the same sense that it's not like anyone could have predicted that 2020 was going to be the way that it is. However, I think that there may have been some signs for people just on a personal level of what maybe was already rising and shifting for them in their lives that then would have set them up to be able to pivot in the way that they have now. So I've seen a lot of businesses that have pivoted in a way that they maybe thought before they might, but then this really just pushed them to get, motoring there. There's a part of you, I think, that always knows. I think 2020 is a unique year in that sense, but usually what happens for people with these smackdowns is that there's been signs along the way that they need to move forward or shift or pivot or whatever, or leave the relationship. And if you don't listen to those over time, like, that's your path. Your soul is already leading there. So you're going to get there no matter what. It's just like, you can either get there really in flow and in a way that feels really like groovy and fun, or you can get there in a way that feels really disorienting and aggressive. And usually after people have one big smackdown, then usually after that, they know, and they know to follow the cues a little bit more. But that's the first thing. So what I try and do is that I'll get people all the time in their smackdown, and I'm like, great. Okay, now that you're here, I'm really just good at picking people up from the rubble and being like, all right, boom, boom, like, let's dust yourself off and let's find your way forward. And I think the reason how I get people out of that is that, like, I think this is the lawyer side of me. Like, let's just get to the point. Enough. It's done. Like, you're in the rubble. Let's just pick yourself up. And here's the vision going forward. Instead of like, why? Why? Well, it happened because it's a smackdown. And this is the way that you're supposed to be moving now. So I think just like getting people not to look so much in the past and just eyes forward, heart up, chin up. And let's just like get you motoring forward and really trust from that place. So what I'm on the opposite side trying to do with people in a lot of my programs, if they find me before a smackdown stage, is to get them to start asking themselves the questions of where am I being guided to grow next? What do I want to create? what would feel really fun? What's the next stage for me? Because we're always in a state of evolution. So if we're constantly in those questions, we can constantly evolve and shift and move with things. So that's a lot of what my work centers on, is hopefully getting people at a point where they're allowing themselves to be, like you say, much more prescriptive. Like they're just starting to build that out way before any smackdown would happen. And then I also have people who try and do that, and then they don't really do it, and then they get the smackdown. And I try not to tell people the smackdown's coming, but I kind of do. And then, I get the call, oh, the person broke up with me, or my job fired me, and I'm like, okay, well, this is what we knew would happen.
So if somebody listening to this right now is going through their version of a smackdown on any magnitude, call it a 1 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10.
Yeah.
Do you have any tools, best practices that you would recommend that are easy for someone to act upon?
Yeah. The first question would be just to sit with, how is this happening for me and not to me? I think that that's the number one thing. How is this happening for me, not to me? What things is it allowing me to let go of that have kept me, tethered to something that maybe I didn't want to be? And what is this creating space for going forward? So why is this happening to me, or why is this happening for me and not to me? What then has this allowed me to let go of? And what is this creating space for? Sometimes people already have the answer to, I know what this is creating space for. Other people have no idea. And then that's kind of the next space of it. But the first thing is just to allow yourself to sit in that contemplation. And if you do sit in that contemplation for a while of, wow, okay, how is this happening for me? Sometimes the for me, if people can't see it, is just, will sometimes just be about the qualities that you're meant to be developing: resilience, tenacity, also learning to listen to your intuition of being like, man, I really knew that this was going to happen, and here I am. And sometimes it's about feeling pain and feeling difficult emotions and challenges, because there's always going to be polarity in life. So sometimes we get, smacked on our ass, so that on the other side, let's say you're at the top of your game, and now you've been completely, there was a dispute, and now you're out of the company or whatever else. And so the perspective might be, okay, well, when I was at the top of my game, maybe it's that I wasn't really fully appreciating all the things in my life, or I wasn't fully appreciating my colleagues, or I wasn't really aware of the gift of my life before. And now I've been, now my health is gone, or this or whatever. And in a very basic sense for people, just to remember that sometimes the lesson, when it feels really painful, and I've had those times before too, it's just like, okay, well, this is making me appreciate when things are really good and really in flow way more. And so I'm going to choose to experience this pain, not resist it, allow myself to be knocked down and disappointed and whatever else, knowing that the deeper that I go into that, the more that I'll be able to access joy and abundance and gratitude on the other side of it.
That's beautiful. I think patience is something many people, myself included, I'll be the first to admit, I used to struggle a lot with patience, and I still find it comes up. It still finds a way to creep in every now and then when I set a goal or I set some sort of task, and it's like, I'm like, where's the success? Where's the contract? And there is this patience. And I'll be honest, I used to be afraid of the silence. I used to be afraid to sit still with my thoughts. And if I wasn't moving a mile a minute, I felt like something was wrong. To me, sitting down for 10 minutes, closing my eyes didn't make sense at one point. The thought of not moving forward. And the second thing I'll say is, I used to live a lot of my life in the past and in the future, and not in the present.
Yeah. It's like part of, we're raised that way, and we're raised to be doing, we're raised to be on, we're raised to be external. And to me, this is all like, so we all have masculine and feminine energy. So yin, yang, for people that just imagine like the yang yang symbol, we both have both within us, no matter who you are. And as a society, we really value that, those masculine yang qualities of go, do, create, explore, go outward, linear, logical, step planning, focus. And I think what's happening right now, and at least a lot of what I've been trying to usher forward, is really a new reverence and a reconnection with aspects of the feminine energy, which are non-doing, which are stillness, surrender, receptivity, allowing things to come to you, allowing ideas to come to you, and really learning. And I think so many people have been learning this year, actually, that just because you're not doing doesn't mean that things aren't happening. And I think that we've been taught that unless I'm doing, unless I'm on, unless I'm moving forward, that I'm stagnant. And it's not true. So the feminine energy would teach us that you can still be still and non in a place of non-doing, and things are still flowing. Like trees are still trees are still growing. You're part of nature. Waves are still moving back and forth. You're a part of that too. And just I think that we're learning a little bit, and I think there'll be more and more over the years of the beauty of non-doing. But it's something that I've like super struggled with over the years, to have taking these times of pause, aside from learning how to just take pause throughout your day.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's rampant. We're just brought up that way.
How do you surrender and live in flow?
I think that the way that we surrender first is allowing yourself to, unless you feel really inspired, if you had that instinct to go and do something, or if if you feel, if it happens, naturally for you to have a conversation with someone, for you to show up for that, but otherwise to not make anything happen for yourself. And I think that that's really contrary to how a lot of people live. But the idea behind it becomes, if you allow yourself to just follow your inspirations, follow those instinctual actions that we feel called to take, to really trust then that that is the action to take, that there's not more to do beyond that, and otherwise to just say yes to the opportunities as they arise for you. So a big part of it comes from not trying to make things happen to you, but rather actually, as opportunities come to you, to say yes to them, and to believe that they're part of your plan. So I was really fascinated with the concept of surrender just for my own spiritual practice. I just kind of got to this perspective of thinking, well, in nature, everything's just unfolding. Like nothing's trying to figure out in nature except for us how to make things happen. And so I started to sit with that perspective of like, wait a second, I don't actually have to make anything happen in my life if I really believe that I'm part of nature. So I started to sit with that concept. And then soon after that, I came across this book called The Surrender Experiment by Michael Singer, which is one of my favorite books of all time. And Michael Singer is a really amazing, not only spiritual teacher, but he's also an incredible entrepreneur. He created $1 billion company, started WebMD. He's had a really, really fascinating life, colored with a lot of really incredible experiences, but also objectively a lot of like incredible entrepreneurial success from, the outward world. And he lives in this way. So here was a person who shares a story, and he's now in his 70s, I believe. And he talks about how he's just been living in this way. And then, and I found it inspiring. And basically what he says, and I then started to adopt, and now I've just lived my life this way for the last few years, is just, yeah, unless you have that creative impulse to do something, just instead allow the opportunities to come. The issue becomes when an opportunity comes to do something, normally our mind comes in with a preference of like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to take that meeting. And just to notice when that's your mind just saying, well, I don't think that that's part of the plan here. I don't think that that really aligns, versus when it is. Sometimes our bodies will have full body no, like that's not the right opportunity. That's not the right time. But for the most part, usually if you're in that flow, opportunities will just come. You'll get into the right conversation at the right time, and things will always feel natural and in flow. Just in terms of that, it won't feel hard. It won't feel effortful. So what I found is that I'll go through periods where I'm like doing a ton of things, but it feels like time, it feels easy basically. And Michael Singer speaks a lot to that in that book. As when he was building out at WebMD, it was when computers first came out. But he said for him, even though computers were so foreign at the time, they came so natural to him. But he said, I wouldn't have been able to get to that experience until I was in my late 40s or 50s when I first got to that place. And then that was the most natural thing, versus in his 20s, he was he was doing yoga and teaching yoga basically all day. And then from there, he started lecturing as a professor, and that felt in flow, and everything just kind of, he says, always felt natural. And that's really been my experience too. So first thing, try that. That would be the most extreme version to live in surrender, would be just to allow yourself, unless you really, really feel called to do it, to not do anything, And then to, as opportunities come that maybe you would have dismissed, just to say yes to them and be curious about where they ultimately lead, because you don't know. And the other part of how you could just then surrender if you're not ready to go like full in on that would just be to allow yourself to not hold so tightly onto timelines. I think that's one place where people really struggle with surrender the most. So if you just set an intention for yourself, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to keep building toward it, but I'm not going to have, which is different what we're taught in like goals setting, but I'm not going to have a specific timeline of when this has to come to pass. And I'm going to stay on track every month, and I'm going to give myself things that I think that I want to do, but to really let go of timelines, that's a big way to surrender, and to trust more in timing too.
That's so amazing. That's very opposite from everything that we've been trained in terms of timelines. And I think the notion of goals, KPIs, how was your quarter, how was your year end, all of these things are daily conversation, right? It's like we almost compare ourselves to somebody's email list saying, oh, Katie has 3,000, I only have 1,000. That means there must be something wrong with me.
Right.
And it's so backwards, right? I mean, comparison is a whole different topic. But how do you go about setting some of your goals now? Clearly you're growing a business, you've got clients, and there's a 99.9% of you is probably surrendered. And I'm loving that analogy. What about that 0.01% where you're like, okay, I've got some financial goals, I've got business goals. How do you set goals?
So the same kind of practice comes in from that place of inspiration and that place of intuition. So I try and build goals or build visions or build numbers based on like what actually feels like it needs to happen. So at the point when I was like really scaling my business at the time where I knew that I was going to be leaving law within that year, like I just felt, okay, I'm about to leave law this year. I need to make sure that this is super solid financially before I leave. So I had really specific metrics, but that came from a place of knowing like, okay, this is the time for this. So the first part of it, the intuition still comes in to being like, okay, what actually makes sense this year for me? And as opposed to being like, what should be? So for example, last year when I met my partner, like that was actually a bigger priority for me, was like developing our relationship such that my goals were more almost reflective of that, of just, okay, it's okay for me to not be so focused on building out these courses, because right now my life, what actually makes the most sense is for me to be focused on this. So then what happens is eventually things shift and you get new ideas. And now what I do is I focus a lot on how many people I want to have in my stuff. So I think that that's basically how I measure most things. Is I really do trust that money will always come. And I do set certain frequencies that I'm always stepping into of new income goals, but I don't frame my income goals in terms of, that's not really what I focus on. I set them and I'll be like, this is how much money I want to make this year or this month. But then what I do is I really focus back to, okay, these are my offerings. These are how many people I would love to see going through these different offerings. So I'd love to have X amount of people in my online courses. I want to have this many people come on retreats. And then what I do to also, then I like half of it too is just I'll do the work, I'll put the programs in. Like I just changed all of my digital courses over to a new server so that I can have more people organically coming through them. Because then if I set a goal, I want to have X amount of people going through my course. When that number is over 100, like you have to have certain systems in place. So I put all that in place, and then the surrender comes back in. Okay, well, I'm going to keep sharing these messages. I'm going to set up this funnel in this way, and I'm going to really trust that those people are going to show up and come through it. And that's kind of how I do it. So it's sort of like twofold. I'll follow through with the strategy, but the strategy comes from, what do I really want here? How many people am I also ready to energetically kind of have in my own space too? And how many customers do I feel like I can really hold in this? And if I'm not going to be as present with other people, how can I make that happen? So I bring the practical based into how can I actually build that out, and what would that look like?
Were you able to find a way to rethink about retreats in 2020 or 2021? Where's your head at when it comes to your retreats right now?
It's so interesting because I was assuming that my retreats wouldn't go ahead, but then interestingly, I had a few women last week reach out, because right now my retreat is kind of on pause. There was supposed to be one in October, and I just don't, even though they want to go, I just don't think it's going to happen this year. I just don't think that I feel good about bringing people into a space together where they're like hugging all the time.
Where was that one supposed to be?
That one's supposed to be in Tulum. So I knew for sure the one in Costa Rica, That one I normally do every November, and that one we've put on pause. I was supposed to do a shorter one in Tulum that was supposed to be in April, and then we postponed to October. And I still don't think it'll go ahead, but I just thought it was curious. And my own surrender, I was like, wait, because normally when people reach out about things, it's sort of usually a sign to me of, okay, we should go ahead with it. But I think I have to just trust. I'm not actually sure what will happen yet. We'll just have to see it through. What I'm doing instead, the one thing is one of the women that I always run this November retreat with, we are talking about just creating something that wouldn't be just a weekend retreat, but there's a lot that happens in the retreat format, just of working with both of us at the same time. So we're talking about doing something that would be a mix of, coaching with both of us, having some sessions doing that, but just in a contained period. So in a month long, doing sessions with both of us, and then having a number of group sessions with the retreat group. And so, but spreading it out basically for the period of November, because we've run our retreat in November the last few years, and it's a really great time, I think, for that type of transformation. So we're pivoting not actually to do it as a weekend retreat online thing. And I've considered doing that, but it just doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't feel like what I want to do right now, but that feels cool. It's like a lot of the retreat, at least the ones that I run, it's the experience of really having both of us there and coaching and leading that group. And so we're going to spread that sort of experience out over the course of a month. So I think that will be neat. And the other thing too is in the trust, in the flow, like right now I've been so focused on my digital programs in a way that I knew that I was going to be, but just from a practical business perspective, like getting those digital courses up and in a place that they're scalable is really where my focus is right now. And so I also just find it interesting. I know I've been doing retreats now for a few years. I know that they'll flow after this. I just think that I'm being really guided to provide really, really like palatable online programs for people. So I actually feel almost relieved, because I'm like, okay, I know that's my work right now, so I'm just going to focus on that.
I love that. Would you say, are you type A or type B, or a hybrid, or what?
Am I? No, I would say I'm actually I'm naturally really aggressively type A, but I've learned to be more chill, but I'm actually not. Like, I think that in my mind, because I'm like, yeah, I'm surrendered, I'm doing everything. I like to think that I'm so chill, but I'm actually not. I'm like the most intense person. And so I have an intensity, and then I check myself, but no, I'm really focused, and so that's, I'm very type A, but then I've learned to not control timelines and things like that, but I'll put in the work where it needs to be put.
That's awesome. I can definitely learn from the last 60 seconds of what you said, because I'm very type A, and I definitely need to let go at times, and I just hold on.
Yeah, it's what's interesting though is that, but then the type A would be like, how do I, I need to be, and then the reality is, if you were just to spend more time in non-doing, which you said you don't like to do, that would naturally, I think, put you into that place of knowing okay, this is the thing that's really important now to focus more of that medi time or whatever else I think might help for anyone who's in the planning. I mean, that means that usually it means that because this is what I do too, you get two in the left brain, and the left side of our brain is very logical and focused and rational. And that's great. But if that part of your brain is being too dominant, then you've cut yourself off from the creative, inspiration, intuitive part. And so just notice when you're in that place of oh, this, and then this thing, and then that thing, just notice, oh, okay, I need to take some time to access the right side of my brain, which means maybe you're painting, or maybe your whatever is creative expression for you can be really helpful. That's from a practical perspective. I do a lot of work with lawyers. That's what I tell them. I can't be yeah, spend more time in meditation. A lot of them don't like that. But from a practical perspective, that makes sense to people. They're like, oh, I'm too focused on X and then B and then, these pieces. And so the idea becomes, that's cool, and we need to use that. But just know if you're too in that space right now, or just making it an ongoing practice of really tapping into creative brain will just help you to ease into that, or to know, helps put the pieces together in a more creative way sometimes.
I love that. I could definitely benefit from more of that creative space and right side of my brain activation.
Yeah, it's that's where my type A intensity comes. I'm very oh shoot, I've been too in this brain, now I'm too in this brain, and it helps though. It helps a lot.
I love it. So I've got 4 final questions.
Okay, great.
One of them you answered, but I'm going to ask it again.
Okay.
Any favorite book recommendations? You talked about the surrender experiment, but anything else that people could benefit from your readings?
Yeah. Okay. So I love The Surrender Experiment and also The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer. Those are two of my favorite books of all time. Just when it comes to surrender and then also when it comes to just spirituality in general and sort of an overview of it. I also love as an intro book, A Return to Love by Marianne Williamson, because she really just goes through. For some people, the book is a little bit too spiritual. So if that feels too crazy for you, like don't do it. But if you really want to start to explore spirituality and just this idea of choosing love and living with more love and trust in your life, that's a really beautiful book to move forward with. And the last one that I'll actually say is for any women who are hearing this call, or women, or anyone who's identified as a woman, or anyone who's really curious in this energy of the divine feminine that we were talking about, this energy of really tapping into this new way, I think, especially for embodying feminine leadership. There are two great books on that. One is Rise Sister Rise by Rebecca Campbell, and the other one is called Shakti Leadership. I can't recall the name of it, because I do think that there's a real shift right now for men and women, but this one specifically for anyone who's identified as a woman. Just how do we embody power, and what does it look like to be in your power, but also in this deeply surrendered, intuitive place? And I think that that's something new that's coming through in society. And so those are really helpful resources, just if you're curious about exploring that perspective too.
Awesome. These are new ones for me to add to the list. I've heard of The Untethered Soul and I've heard of The Surrender Experiment. Always felt like a part of me wasn't ready for it.
Yeah, trust that. It's so cool when books find you at the right time.
There was a book, Think and Grow Rich, that I tried to read like 5 times, and I would get 2 or 3 chapters in every time. I'm like, I'm just not ready for it. And then I finally felt ready for it the 6th time, read it, but even then only got to about 90%.
Oh, interesting.
And something at the very end just made me put it down.
Happened. There's another book by the same author that did Think and Grow Rich called, it's like the devil. I think it honestly is like the devil or something in it. Like, I don't recall the name of it, but that's a great book too.
Outwitting the Devil.
Outwitting the Devil. That's another good book for people to just noticing the ways basically that we get in our own way. And I think there's some there's some things in that book that are a little crazy and sexist, but there are also things in that book that are just helpful ways of just noticing where we self-sabotage basically.
So you have officially become the person on the podcast who has recommended the most books. So kudos to you.
That's good reading. So
I love that. My next question is, what are you most excited about in the next 60 days?
You know what I'm most excited about in the next 60 days is that I'm going to be going 2 things. I'm going to be going back to Toronto. I haven't been in Toronto really at all this year in full surrender, like by reasons that were so out of my control, not only with COVID and like I left on a vacation and then just have never come back. But also earlier this year, my parents had to stay in my apartment for a little bit. I had some flights that got delayed so that would keep me in other places longer. Like so many things have happened that pulled me out of Toronto. And what I think will be so fun is that I'll be going back there in the next 60 days. And I'm just really excited when you've been away from something for so long. And I think I've been doing so much growth. And the last 6 months I've just been with my partner. Like I haven't been around anyone familiar to me. And I'm just so curious to see, I'm like so excited for that, of what it's like to go back to a place that I've known so well, now knowing that I've changed so much over this time, and just seeing like what that feels like. And obviously I'm sure my friendships and everything are great, but it's so interesting when you've been away for so long, or if you've ever had long travel stretches, or you moved to a new place. For me, I grew up in Toronto, so I hadn't really had that experience as much, but I'm excited to go back and feel what that's like. And the second thing that I'm honestly really excited about is these digital courses. I'm just so excited to get them up and running and doing all the stuff for them. And that will all be done in the next 60 days. It's almost done now. So I'm really excited to finally have that in motion. It was one thing of having those courses available and having funnels built into them that I always knew I wanted to do, but it just wasn't the time. And now it is. So I'm excited to do that. And then like fingers crossed and hope that works.
Oh, Catie, this is amazing. I can literally feel the energy radiating off of you onto my screen.
Oh, good.
And my last question. Tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
The entire world wakes up. Every city, every country wakes up tomorrow morning, and they're all looking at the exact same billboard. but Catie gets to control the message
Right.
written on the billboard, what would you say?
Choose love.
Choose love. I love it.
Yeah.
Catie, where is the best place for people to find you?
People can find me through my website, which is catiefenn.com. And then that links to all the other things like on Instagram, Catie Fenn. Those are the two best ways to get in touch or learn more. If you go onto my website, for those of you who are now in the thing of like we talked about, wanting to just ask yourself the questions first instead of getting a spiritual smackdown, if you go onto my website, there's a resource that will pop up there. Or if you go to free resources, it's called Soul Map. And it just contains 20 to 30 of my favorite journal questions to really ask yourself when you're in that period of thinking that there's something new or different from you, to start that process of figuring out what's flowing, what's not, and what you might want to be moving in for. Yeah, Annalisa, choose love.
Yeah, Annalisa has been watching this
Imagine
entire
that
time.
every day people woke up and they're like, you know what? I'm not going to be a dick today. I'm going to choose love. Like, it's a miracle.
I love it. Catie, I'm so grateful to have met you when I was first coming into this big
Toronto.
city from a small little town in St. John's. And just, it's been really fun seeing how happy you are with your partner, and just the joy, the passion, the love. You're just really stepping into like Catie 2.0 since I've known you. And I'm just really grateful that I can call you a friend. And I really want to just thank you for spending your morning with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'll use our example as just one last thing for people to see, is that that's how Karan and I first met, was at this event that I was hosting in Toronto right when he first got there. And I think that that's when you're in that flow, you just always trust that you'll meet the right people at the right time. That was 2 years ago. Then we like ended up on randomly on panels together, and then here we are in this moment. So really trusting that every person that comes into your life is, it's a beautiful thing, that the right people are always being brought to you, and that's a really great place to be. Thank you so much for having me, and so excited about everything that you're doing and all these conversations that you're having. I'm sure everyone maybe who's listening to this already knows, but I feel like Karan is just one of the best conversation makers and questioners. So keep flowing with what you're doing too.
I really appreciate you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thanks for bringing up kind of how we met and how we've been able to maintain this relationship over the last couple of years. It's been amazing. And I'm excited to see where the next year takes us as well.
Yeah. Can't wait.
Thanks, Catie.